This webinar is being held by the Friends. It's organised by Tor Lund, our Honorary Secretary, who will run the computer and the Zoom. The object of the Friends of the Holbrook Submarine Museum is to channel funds to it, support it with volunteers, give it expertise if it needs it. The museum itself is only a small part of the Greater Hume Shire, and the Friends so far has had good funding from our friends and our supporters, including the SIA, and we've completed a lot of projects there. And our volunteers are doing great work, including on the AE2. Roger Cooper's part of our audience today. He's the main driver there. Now, the webinar today is some aspects of the wreck of the Australian submarine AE2, which is most of, if not all of you know, was sunk in the Sea of Marmara in Turkey in 1915. You can all see the map here, I hope, and I'll go into some detail about it. AE2 was the first of the Allied fleet to get through the Dardanelles. Several ships have been sunk by the mines, and the forts along the side were formidable. The battleships had tried to get past the forts, but they'd been defeated by the combination of forts and mines. The B-class submarines couldn't make it through the Dardanelles with their smaller batteries, even though Lieutenant Holbrook, when he got his VC, managed to get far enough up to sink one of the old Turkish battleships. So it was a formidable problem. You can see there the lines on the map where the mines were, and then you can see where the guns were along the cliffs. And then at the top right, you should be able to see where it opens into the Sea of Marmara. After a most exciting passage through, the AE2 finally managed into the Sea of Marmara and bottomed until nightfall when it charged its batteries. Now, our seminar today is not about the operational side of it. For that, we'll hold another seminar, and we need different speakers: Peter Briggs, Ken Gregg, Terry Roach, and Selçuk Kole from Turkey, if we can find him. This is about the technical aspects when we have found the AE2 on the bottom. Now, we have the two speakers, Dr. Mark Spencer and Dr. Roger Neal. And Mark Spencer is qualified dentist, and that's his main profession. And he qualified in 1977, but in 1978, he took to underwater diving in a big way. Over the years since then, he's been published widely in journals. He has dived on major wrecks all over the world. He is one of the world's leading divers, and he went on two of the expeditions to AE2, which he'll tell you about. His publications include a new book by him, which he calls Ocean of Self, which he talks about his life and his diving. The second speaker is Dr. Roger Neal. Roger is a scientist. He's got a BSc and a PhD in sciences. He trained initially in medical physical sciences, but in 1988, he went into the defence science, DSTO, for those who knew part of it, and included in his projects was studying sonar, autonomous underwater systems, and also wrecks. Roger was on two of the expeditions, 2007, 2014, about which he'll speak. Well, welcome everybody again. We have two excellent speakers, and we will now start. So over to you, Mark Spencer.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. I appreciate that introduction. I and some friends of mine undertook some extra training in the use of mixed breathing gases, including helium, to explore the deeper range of shipwrecks beyond 60 metres. That was back in the mid-1990s. And then in 1997, I read an article in the Sydney Morning Herald by a Fred and Elizabeth Brenchley, journalists, that the Australian World War I submarine AE2 was allegedly discovered in the Sea of Marmara in Turkey, but not yet confirmed. So cut a long story short, I ended up speaking to Bronwyn Bishop, who was then the Minister for Defence, Science and Technology. And she then delivered a direction to the Royal Australian Navy to assist me, at least look at my proposed project to bring a team over there, a team including a professional maritime archaeologist, another diver, considered amateur maritime archaeologist, considered one of the best in Australia for identifying deep shipwrecks, and other expert divers to go over there and bring back confirmation of that discovery. So in 1997, we went over there with help from the Royal Australian Navy, and we'll have a look at a picture that shows you what we discovered. Now, this was the wreck that was allegedly AE2, and this particular wreck was quite a deep depth, 86 metres in fairly murky, dark water. The water temperature down there was 14 degrees. And you'll see that that's the very bow stem of this particular wreck. So it's probably a good spot for us to land on. And the bow stem was very clearly not that of AE2. And furthermore, when we swam along that bow a little bit, we saw portholes, which of course you won't find on any submarine of a naval type. The diving technology. So in we mentioned to a team of journalists and our Turkish host Selçuk Kolay, who was looking for AE2 and thought he had found it. We told him that sadly that wasn't the wreck, and to keep his search going. So a year later, I got a phone call from Selçuk saying that he had found AE2, and he sent me a video tape which verified, or strongly suggested, let's say, that it was a submarine of the E-class type. Still, more photography was needed. And this is the picture of me entering the water, 1998, off the MV Saros, the boat that belonged to the museum of which Selçuk Kolay was director. And you'll see at my right shoulder there, a gentleman by the name of John Thompson. And his grandfather was leading signalman Albert Thompson, who probably typed the Morse code saying that the AE2 had successfully penetrated the Dardanelles Strait and was in the Sea of Marmara. John is assisting me there. We're using open circuit scuba, which means we've packed our helium mixture into the bottles on my back, and the nitrox, various grades of oxygen, on my side tanks there. We use the helium mixtures on the bottom and the nitrox, the enriched air with oxygen, for our decompression on the way up. Next picture. We had very good support. This is Dr. Arkin Toklu with the sheepish grin there, a man of a great sense of humour, but also a very educated and accomplished diving medical doctor, an expert in hyperbaric medicine. And here he and his chief technician were there to support us in case we had a decompression problem, and that was a recompression chamber. We knew that we would be expertly supported by the doctor and his assistant if we had decompression problems. that's the technology of the diving. The wreck that we dived on only had visibility of about 4 to 5 meters. So we could only see 4 or 5 meters of the wreck at any time. Based on all the photography I had, one of my team members, John Riley, built this wreck based on the original construction diagrams of the ship, of the submarine, and he built the submarine according to those details and then poured bits off it, more or less deconstructing the wreck to make it resemble how we saw it back there in 1998. And it's sitting on the mud seafloor of the Sea of Marmara, roughly to the depth you see it there in the model. This is the stern of the submarine with holes in the casing, just corrosion holes. And you can see the rudder there turned, that'll become slightly clearer later, turned slightly to starboard. Here you can see on the very stern, the rudder turned slightly to starboard. And the propeller, some of the propeller blade tips out of the mud floor. So that's how we saw it. Interestingly, just to point out, that rudder turned slightly to starboard was depicted. John Thompson's grandfather was an artist, and he actually made a series of sketches, and one of them was the AE2 sinking bow first with the stern sticking out of the water, and he had the rudder turned slightly to starboard. So I thought that was a very fascinating thing to confirm with the actual finding of the wreck. Here's the bow of AE2 looking orange, and the orange colour looks pretty, but it actually depicts active corrosion going on by the constant scraping of the metal with fishing nets and ropes that are rubbing across the submarine. Very diagnostic, I use a dental word there, very diagnostic that this was AE2, was the sloping or the ramped casing of AE2, typical of the first 10 E-class submarines that came out of Britain, and Australia acquired 2 submarines of that first 10. The first 10 were built with the sloping casing, and after that, the rest of the 40, 50, whatever submarines built in the UK had a level casing. Here we are forward of the conning tower, and you can see the telegraphy post with bits of fishing line attached to it. And that telegraphy post sits slightly to the starboard of the casing of AE2. Here is the forward part of the conning tower, and you can see the forward periscope covered with lots of algae and barnacles, which, while detracting a bit from the photogenic quality of AE2, does impart some protection against active corrosion. Here is my diving friend. In fact, he was the director of diving operations on our expedition, Richard Taylor. I handed him the Explorers Club flag, and that's the picture of it. Sadly, we lost that flag on our ascent. It somehow slipped out of our pockets, and we lost it, which was a sad thing because that flag had probably been on tops of mountains and other difficult to get to destinations, just like this was a difficult to get to destination under the sea. And well, this is the starboard side of the top of the conning tower. So what you're seeing there is the aft periscope to your left, and to your right, the forward periscope. And on the top there, a wire connecting them to would be a deflecting wire, which would continue forward of the conning tower and aft to help deflect nets when the submarine was passing through the various barricades put up by the Turks. What's significant about this picture, of course, is that you can see that the access hatch is opened to the starboard side, and left open, resting on a dog leg, I believe it's called, as Commander Stoker left it when he scuttled the submarine in 1915. An operational submarine, the hatch, of course, wouldn't open due to the pressures. So the fact that it is open suggested this was a scuttled submarine. Sticking out of the access hatch there, the main hatch, you can see an eel. That's a conger eel. And John Thompson, his grandfather, the leading signalman, Albert Thompson, was nicknamed Bunce. And so John suggested we call the conger eel Bunce, and that name has stuck ever since. Even on subsequent expeditions, we believe Bunce made an appearance, and you might see some more pictures of Bunce, courtesy of Dr. Roger Neal shortly. You wouldn't want to stick your hand in there because conger eels have been known to bite, but they're not aggressive by nature. But nevertheless, we were respectful of this new inhabitant of AE2. This is the aft part of the fin or conning tower of AE2, and you can see it had undergone quite a bit of breakdown, corrosion, but still, nevertheless, that is the basic, fully intact conning tower, which was different to what was seen on the subsequent expeditions where that aft part was eaten apart quite significantly. What we dived on in 1998 was essentially a very intact submarine. And when I first descended on the wreck and stood on the aft casing, it was quite an amazing feeling because I felt like I was on a submarine that could still take off and move. I felt like this was a fully intact submarine, and it didn't take too much from my imagination to believe that I was on an active submarine. This is near where I stood on that first dive. This is the stanchion compartment, which I believe held some of the rigging for the wireless aerials and so forth. A bit corroded there, some of the probably the timber hatch. That's just to the aft of the conning tower. Here, a bit of a murky picture with a bit of, you might see some of the holes there where the railing poles were to hold a railing so people, officers wouldn't fall into the water as they walked along the casing. Of course, those railing poles would have been taken down for active operations so they wouldn't snag on nets. This is a man hatch over the aft firing compartment of AE2. So we're at the very, very rear end of the casing, just before it drops off. And that's my friend Merv Marr. He's actually ditched his side tanks, our decompression tanks, just to make his dive a little bit lighter and easier. And he's swimming along the top of the casing there towards the stern. Here is the aft casing where it drops off dramatically on the main hull of AE2. I don't know what that pole is lying on the side. It could be from a fishing vessel. I don't know if it belongs to AE2, but we can show the next picture, which this is the starboard side of the stern of AE2, and you can see the propeller blade on the starboard propeller blade sticking out of the mud substrate, and the hydroplane, the aft hydroplane to Merv's right shoulder there. The mud floor there, when I was taking these pictures, I had to use the ground to support myself, and my hands sunk into that mud fairly deeply. So it was pretty soft, and it also had the effect of kicking up dust and making the water more murky. So one had to be very gentle trying to take photographs around the aft part of the vessel. Another shot of the stern, also showing that rudder turned slightly to starboard, and you can see a bit of the shape of the rudder to your right there, and some active rust on the stern of AE2. Here's the rudder turned slightly to starboard, and that would be the aft torpedo hatch right at the rear end of the hull of AE2 there. That's the AE2 as we saw it in 1998. What a incredible, one of my highlights in diving, to dive on a fairly intact wreck, and to know also that here we were diving on what would arguably have to be the largest important icon of the Gallipoli landings in 1915. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That was terrific. Roger, over to you to tell us about some of the scientific aspects.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the webinar today. I trust that you'll find it both interesting and enjoyable. I was Science Director on 2 so-called maritime archaeological assessments of AE2. They were both surveys which were undertaken at the site of AE2, and each of those assessments had different purposes. During the course of this discussion, I think you'll realise that the second one very much flowed out of the outcomes of the first. And I'll kick straight into it. And this is by necessity a very short romp through our 2 visits that we made. The 2007 Maritime Archaeological Assessment, its purpose was to assess the residual strength of the AE2's hull. The reason for that was that there'd been quite a strong proposal to have AE2 either recovered onto the surface or shifted into a shallow water site. And we needed to know whether there was sufficient strength left in the hull to enable that recovery to be undertaken. We also needed to make environmental measurements. We wanted to know what the environment was like in the location where she was sitting, just in case we did choose to leave her there. We wanted to know whether it was a good spot for her to be in terms of her long-term preservation. But we also, in case she was to be moved, we needed to know what the characteristics of the seabed were like, because it would have been very embarrassing if we'd put slings underneath her to raise her and then she disappeared in a cloud of mud. We also wanted to search the hull for battle damage. There were supposedly, or there are 3 shell holes through into the engine room. We wanted to know whether we could find those. And we also wanted to make an assessment as to whether it would be warranted to undertake an internal investigation of the inside the submarine. This was a bit of a pioneering expedition in the sense that we made use of both divers and remotely operated vehicles. And we had both in the water at the same time working together. And it set in place a model which proved very effective and has been used subsequently both by us and others. So the first thing that we found when we dived on AE2 was that she'd been smashed up compared to the pristine state she was in when Mark dived on her in 1998. The very first view of the divers had was of the bow, and we discovered that the bow had been essentially peeled back. So it had been split in half, and in fact there was damage to the first 15 metres of the casing. And the culprit was that's the start of the towing pennant on the port side. And that's the rest of it. And what had happened was that some fishing equipment had picked up that towing pennant, dragged it across the hull, and in the process had smashed a large proportion of the forward casing. But almost miraculously, the midships area of the boat had survived. So the telegraphy post that Mark pointed out in his presentation, still in place, and the conning tower was undamaged. And that was particularly heartening, because if the conning tower had been sheared off, then the inside of the boat would have been exposed to the elements, and that would have been catastrophic. It could have been so much worse though. This is a multi-beam echo sounder survey that was undertaken shortly after that MAA. And you can see here a big scour, and that's probably the one that destroyed the forward casing, where something's jumped over the top of the boat and then it's contacted the bottom and made this big scour. There's another one at the back here, and we could see evidence of where that had contacted the back of the boat. And there's also, we think, another one here. So she obviously had taken a lot of attention from fishing, and she was very lucky that the midship section was preserved. From an environmental standpoint, we found that this was actually an almost ideal location for AE2 to be parked. The oxygen levels were low, but not too low. So corrosion was very slow, and because there was some oxygen in there, you weren't getting some of the bacterial corrosion that other wrecks see. She was structurally in very good condition, but we weren't able to find the shell holes. And the reason for that was that there's a lot of concretion over the top of the hull, and that's concretion that actually protects the hull. However, the other thing though is that she had come very, very close to catastrophic damage from fishing activity. As I mentioned, we wanted to take a look inside AE2 to see whether it was worthwhile then coming back and taking a very detailed look. We were frightened or worried that the inside of the boat may be totally full of silt. But so we designed a drop camera. And this drop camera was based on a camera that could be bought at the time, used by sports fishermen to record the strike when marlin, for example, take the hook. So we got one of those and we connected it to a length of flexible electrical conduit, and I put together a system built out of sewer pipe, and the idea was that that would be fed through the partially open slot formed by the upper hatch, and then lowered down through the two hatches into the control room. This is very much a Heath Robinson affair, and the divers were very skeptical that it would work, but in fact it worked very well. And our lighting system was just a dive torch that we cable tied to the camera. That's an image showing the diver at the top of the conning tower with a pair of vice grips that we used as our rotation system. And all we'd do is we'd say to him through water comms, please lower the camera a bit, turn a bit 90 degrees, and he'd use the vice grips to do that. In fact, it worked very well. These are some images from inside the boat. The first one is inside the conning tower. That's the access ladder, and that's the port side aft scuttle that's been opened. In fact, all four of those scuttles we found were open, and obviously Stoker had a look through those before he exited the boat to make sure that he wasn't about to be rammed by the torpedo boat. Also inside the conning tower, we could see that's the telegraph, and that's the steering wheel that was inside that conning tower. And then we moved, then we moved down into the control room, and the very first thing we saw was, apart from the access ladder, was the steering shaft that runs to the back of the boat. And that's a universal joint that allows the shaft to run through the length of the boat. That's the steering engine. And this is a 3D computer simulation that I made of that part of the boat. You'll see that it corresponds very well. And that was done off plans. And this is the aft periscope, and that's the limit switch which prevents it from being lifted too high. And that is part of the electric training mechanism, which was a unique feature of these boats. The conclusions from 2007 were that the drop camera images indicated her interior was relatively clear of sediment, in excellent condition, and it really made us want to come back and have another look. Ultimately, following that survey, it was decided that the best thing to do for AE2 was to protect her, to leave her in situ, but take steps to protect her, preserve her, and study her and tell her story. So that led to the 2014 assessment. Our aims were quite different from the first expedition, whereas in the first one, the aims were to assess the structure of the boat. In this case, the aims were to protect the wreck, to preserve it, to use modern technology and scientific techniques to add to the knowledge of AE2 and E-class boats generally. Once again, this expedition, we had divers and remotely operated vehicles working side by side. Once again, that was a very effective formula. Protecting AE2, we considered various options, including building a big picket fence around the site to stop fishing nets and the like. But ultimately, it was decided that a large buoy should be put in place with lights and radar reflectors and the like on it. That buoy was put in place, but just a year later, in 2015, it was found that it had been stripped of all of its solar panels and lights and radar reflectors. So that subsequently has been replaced by a larger, more robust unit. And there's a direct link to the Turkish Coast Guard, so that if anyone does interfere with that buoy, they'll be visited very quickly. Preserving AE2, what we decided to do, and why won't that change? What we decided to do was to cathodically protect the wreck. So what we ended up doing was we built 3 large anode arrays, which were laid on the seabed, and heavy cables were used to connect them to pre-prepared points on the hull. So there, a clamp has been put onto the forward periscope standard. Another one was placed onto one of the hydroplane protectors, and another one was placed onto the anchor windlass. The end result of this is that it's proved very effective, but it's the largest cathodically protected iron shipwreck in the world. We believe that these arrays will last at least 20 years and probably beyond before they need changed. Final part of our efforts was to gain knowledge and to tell the AE2 story. What we aim to do is to put a remotely operated vehicle inside the AE2 and do a tour around inside the boat, inside the control room. The following is a very quick tour. So inside the conning tower, we found that the leading signalman Thompson, whose nickname was Bunce, this is his flag locker, which we found on the starboard side of the conning tower. And what we found was that Bunce obviously liked his comforts, because sitting in the top of the flag locker, neatly stowed upside down, is a pair of plimsolls. Obviously, he liked to put the nice comfortable slippers on his feet. That's the steering wheel for the bridge, the upper bridge, and that can be broken into 2 parts so as it can come through the hatch. This was our first view inside the control room, and it blew our minds. It was absolutely magnificent sight to see first up. It's the starboard side main ballast pump. You can see Kingston valve wheels with the tallies still on them, junction boxes. It was just in such magnificent condition, we were astounded. Gauges, of course, there are millions of gauges on board the boat. And these three gauges tell interesting stories in their own right. The right-hand ones are pressure gauges. This one's in feet, maximum depth 100 feet. This one's in pounds per square inch. And you can see this one's hard up against its stop. In fact, with the adventures that the crew had in the Sea of Marmara, the boat actually exceeded 100 feet several times. So it spent a fair amount of time with gauges hard up against their stops for the pressure. But the speed log, I think, is quite amusing because it's got a maximum of speed of 30 knots. And I don't think there was much danger that needle would ever be hard up against its stop. Switchboards, the electrical switchboards in the boat are in excellent condition. You can see the fuse holders, switches. This is the wooden bar that protects the crewman from falling into the thing. And there's another knife switch connector there. And this here on the left is the aft plainsman's pedestal. Inside the boat, sorry, there's an image that's missing. Ornate scroll work. So inside the officers' quarters, there's an ornate desk there with folding legs that have been ornately scrolled. Voice pipes. The main table that's in the officers' mess, they obviously found it inconvenient to get around, so they turned it upside down, laid it on its back, and just walked across the top of it. And the light fitting, which you may have noticed, was a Clambroth style light fitting that sat over the top of Commander Stoker's desk. Some of the knowledge that we gained and mysteries that we solved in the course of the expedition. The first one was we'd wondered how the crew on that faithful radio transmission signal of the 25th of April, how the crew could have raised the radio mast without being on the surface so long that they'd be detected. So what we thought was perhaps they'd use something along this lines with a very temporary mast or jury-rigged mast. What we actually found inside the conning tower was a bracket, a hinged bracket with a mounting point and a pole. And we're pretty sure that that pole would mate with that point there. And then there was a roll of hookup cable. Is that the temporary radio mast and connection? We don't know, but it seems very likely. In case of rapid acquisition, in October 1913, the Admiralty had run trials of the brand new Sperry gyro compasses. And just 4 months later, AE1 and AE2 had these gyro compasses installed before they headed for Australia. We knew they'd been installed, but we didn't know where they were. So we were absolutely thrilled to find when we got inside the boat that bolted to the main access ladder is the gyro repeater with the steering pedestal just behind so the helmsman could see it. You can see the scale there. And the gyro itself is shaped like a barrel and it's on the port side. It's been shoehorned in just aft of the main ballast pumps. Commander Stoker tells in Straws in the Wind, his book, he tells a fascinating and exciting story about the events that led up to the abandonment of AE2. And he talks about that the submarine made an uncontrolled dive, which actually culminated in the stern having shells shot through it. He talks about the inclination down by the bows became more and more pronounced. She seemed to be trying to stand on her nose. And then he says, everything that could fall over fell. And he describes plates, cups, knives, forks, eggs, everything falling down in a snow from the midshipman's mess, sorry, the petty officer's mess into the front of the boat. So we fully expect that we'd find a pile of debris stacked up against the forward bulkhead. But what we in fact found was very little debris in the front of the boat. And what's more, sitting on Stoker's desk, quite unconstrained, not in a fiddle, not in any way bolted down or constrained, is a crystal decanter. So the suspicion is that, like all good submariners, Stoker didn't allow the absolute facts to get in the way of a good yarn. The final one that I want to talk about is the location of the final torpedo. various diary records suggested that the torpedo was in the aft torpedo tube. And as a result of that was that, especially in the 2007 visit, we were very careful when we approached that aft torpedo door. We didn't want to bump it because gun cotton explosives can become very unstable in time. But in fact, when we actually got inside the midship space, one of the midships torpedo tubes has actually been badly compromised. And you see here, it's actually, the lid of the tube is actually blown out and rolled back, and its reinforcing rings have been snapped off. And we think that those reinforcing rings, you can see here, there's one of them there. These lids were very, very strong. They were so heavy that they had to be, they had a wheel arrangement, a geared wheel arrangement to open them, and they had to be opened in two halves. So really the only way that something like this could have happened is if some sort of an explosive event has taken place. And we suspect that either there's been a deflagration, a partial explosion of the warhead, or the compressed air system has blown the lid open. Again, not absolutely definitive, but we're pretty sure that that's an indication that the torpedo was in fact in the rearmost one of the midships torpedo tubes. As you can see, there's a fascinating number of things that we found. This is only a very, very quick romp through the boat, and there's many, many more things I could be telling you about. However, my time is up, so I'd just like to say that I dedicate this presentation to the wonderful and awe-inspiring crew of the AE2. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Roger. That was terrific and much appreciated to give us that side of it all. We do have a time for a couple of questions, and Thor has taken some on chat. Thor, would you like to take read out a few questions to Mark or to Roger, and they can answer them?
The first one is to Mark about the water temperatures.
Yes. Now, we definitely wore dry suits, which keep us very warm. Water temperature, I'm trying to think now. Oh, okay, I've got here, I'm just looking at my an article I wrote for Australian Warship Review. The temperature on the bottom was 14 degrees centigrade. Oh, that was the deeper wreck on the first dive. I think our subsequent expeditions, 16 degrees on the bottom I've got here, with 21 degrees near the surface. So right near the surface, which was more brackish freshwater, a bit warmer, and 21 degrees is actually quite a nice temperature. 16, very, very chilly.
Thank you, Mark. The other question results on the actual sediment on the bottom. Question was it not possible to put slings under the boat? That one, I guess, is for you, Roger.
Yeah. So what we were concerned about was that the boat might be sitting in such a way that if we started to disturb underneath it, that it might just keep going down. But in fact, the seabed was it's actually quite firm, and it would very much lend itself to having slings slipped in underneath. So, you know, if there was a will, there was no technical reason why you couldn't undertake a recovery. There were a whole bunch of other reasons, though, which I think led to the decision that it just wasn't a practical option to recover it.
I think I can add to that, in that there was very vigorous debate between those who wanted to raise the submarine and display it in Turkey and Australia, and those who were more on the archaeological historical side, who'd said it'd only been 2 years in operations and over 90 years submerged, and really on balance it should be left where it is. The other thing was cost. If you did bring it out of the water, it would corrode rapidly unless you've spent years doing special treatment to it. So it would have been millions to bring it up, and in the end it was left where it is. It's not the end of it. It may be possible to bring up, say, a propeller or 2 propellers, one for Turkey, one for Australia, but that's for the future.
Okay, another question here is, what is the intended future for AE2?
Roger?
I'll have a go. So as Michael hinted, you know, it's not impossible that some sort of recovery could be undertaken into the future, and that was why we were so keen to cathodically protect the boat. Given that anode system, there's no reason why another 100 years should be an easy goal. So that's the first thing. At the moment, I think there is no strong proposal to recover at the moment any part of the boat. From an Australian point of view, the Australian National Maritime Museum is taking carriage of being the champion for AE2. And I think any future activities, for example, another survey, which I'd love to get involved with, would have to be undertaken through the Maritime Museum, I think.
Thank you, Roger. One more question that came in was, you mentioned about the torpedoes. Were there any torpedoes left on the submarine?
I think I answered that one. we do believe that one that was in the midships torpedo tube was the final torpedo.
I've read all the answer to that question is, I and others have read all the journals of the AE2 crew, and they're undecided because we didn't know exactly how many had been loaded when they sailed, and the journals weren't entirely accurate about how many had been fired. So there was some doubt about whether there was one left, and that doubt's still there. And of course, the warhead, after 100 years underwater, is fairly unstable. So there wasn't a lot of interest to be vigorous in disturbing the torpedo tubes. Glaciers sent off, exploded the warhead.
Thank you, Mike. One more question. The reports were that the boat went down at a steep angle, but it appears that a lot of the material remained almost intact. Was it left that way, or was it secured that way? It's one for Roger, I guess, because he had a look in there. Yeah,
look, we got right up to the forward bulkhead. We actually went into the forward torpedo room, but you know, we would have expected that there would have been a whole pile of debris up against the forward bulkhead if you know, she had you know, had a really steep dive, and we couldn't find anything that was sort of untoward. You know, there was one drawer which had come adrift, which looked for all the world like it had a tube of toothpaste in it, which I had to go and look up whether toothpaste tubes existed then, and they did. But you know, there were things like there's an optical instrument sitting between the two hydroplane controls, and it doesn't look as though it's bracketed. It looks as though it's just sitting there, but it looks as though it's meant to be there. And you know, in the wardroom, there's a shelf, and there's a glass jar sitting on the shelf. Again, it's quite undisturbed. So, you know, we couldn't find anything that suggested, you know, an extreme angle of inclination.
I can add a little bit to that, to the questioner. I think Roger was taking his description out of Straws in the Wind, written by Stoker, I think in 1925. After the war, Stoker went into theatre, and when he came to write his book, his many skills, his enormous range of skills, including making his book popular. So it was more a popular account than a technical account. So he might have exaggerated a little bit about that aspect to get it through to the lay reader, just how desperate was their plight with the gunboat on the surface and them plunging up and down through the densities of water and underneath. One of the density problems was that the fresher water near the surface was running out of the catchment through the Black Sea, and there was a countercurrent from the Mediterranean of salt water running in. That made it very difficult for AE2 because the surface ships didn't know about it. Nobody knew about it till AE2 went through.
One last question that has been raised. I think you made mention, Roger, of the periscope training mechanism.
Yes.
Was that a powered training mechanism or something wound by hand?
No, it was this was I think it was very revolutionary actually for its time, and I suspect that it can't have been terribly successful because it disappeared. And I gather, you guys would be better to tell me, but I gather that it didn't reappear until the O-boats came along. But just above the hand controls was a training ring. It was electrically driven, so you reached up and you could adjust both the direction of rotation and the speed by just reaching up and turning the ring one way or the other. And the way it was engaged was with a cone clutch. There was a cast iron cone clutch and a very large solenoid, so that as soon as you actually turned the ring a little bit, this cone clutch would go thunk and lock onto the shaft of the periscope, and then an electric system rotated it. We've got the plans of that, and I've built a computer model of that system, which is a bit of a segue into the ad that I gather's on the computer screen here. I talk about that in this book, about the way that system worked.
Lots of us of our questions.
Thank you, everyone. That's about all the time we have now for this webinar, as an hour. Our speakers, Mark Spencer and Roger Neal, have given us a wonderful insight into these technical aspects, and we're very glad to have their expertise to tell us about it. If I could just mention two things in closing, one of which those who aren't already members of the Friends of Holbrook Submarine might think about going onto the website and paying their $25 for 3 years membership. And the last thing is to say, as I now close our webinar, thank you all. There's a slide which Thor will now speak to, showing about Roger Neal's book. Roger's been working really hard for the last few months, putting into a book form his technical expertise, and Thor will now tell you about it, and the Friends will be publishing that shortly.
Thanks, Mike. The book arose out of an idea for a couple of articles for our newsletter. The material was far too good to simply put into an article. So with my bending Roger's arm, we started to put the thing together, and it's come together quite nicely. It's had already had some accolades from Australian National Maritime Museum, who saw it as a very worthwhile publication. As Mike said, we will be publishing it in the next few weeks once we've finalised a few things up. It is a great read. It really is. It's not just a technical read, but it's an interesting read. It has a lot of pictures in it, a lot more than what you've seen today. And I'd highly commend you to get a copy of it. If you wish to get a copy of it, feel free to send me an email, and the address is at the top there, and I'll put you on the list for